Our tech mogul set up cameras to fire his African-American housekeeper, but what he saw brought him to tears. Once upon a time, there lived a man named Richard Sterling. He was 45 years old and owned one of the largest tech companies in the entire country. His name regularly appeared in business magazines. His face was known in every corporate circle in the nation. He had built his empire from the ground up. He had started selling used computers in a shed, and now he had offices in 6 different countries. His estate had 32 rooms, 4 swimming pools, a private helipad, and a garden so large it needed 3 full-time gardeners to maintain it. But Richard Sterling was not happy because his wife had died exactly 8 months ago. Caroline, that was her name, a sweet woman with an easy laugh and an enormous heart. They had been married for 15 years. They had built everything together. They had dreamed together. And one morning in July, a drunk driver had taken it all away forever. The accident had been instantaneous. Caroline hadn't suffered. At least, that's what the doctors said. But his son had suffered. Matthew was 8 years old when he lost his mother. He was a smart child, curious, full of questions about the world, and from the day of the funeral, he hadn't spoken again, not a single word. The doctors called it selective mutism caused by trauma. It was a condition in which the brain was overwhelmed by grief, simply shut the door to verbal communication. Richard had hired the best psychologists in the country. He had brought in specialists from Europe. He had tried experimental therapies that cost fortunes. None had managed to get Matthew to say a single word. The boy simply stared into space with empty eyes, as if his soul had left with his mother. He ate when food was put in front of him. He slept when he was taken to bed. He bathed when someone guided him to the bathroom. But he didn't speak. He didn't smile. He didn't play. He was like a ghost, living in the body of an 8-year-old boy. And Richard, although he had billions of dollars, couldn't buy the one thing he truly needed: the voice of his son, every night, after work. Richard went to Matthew's room and sat by his bed. He told him about his day. He told him stories, and he told him how much he loved him. And Matthew simply looked at him, without responding, without reacting. Sometimes Richard cried silently, hoping that his tears would awaken something in his son. But nothing worked. The pain of losing Caroline was enormous. But watching his son slowly fade away was a torture that Richard didn't know how to endure. One morning in March, the domestic service agency sent a new housekeeper. The previous one had quit. She couldn't handle the gloomy atmosphere of the estate, she had said. Richard hadn't even blinked. Housekeepers came and went constantly. None lasted more than a few months. The new one was named Esther Brown. She was 65 years old. She was an African-American woman, with skin as dark as the deepest night. Her hair was completely white, pulled back in a simple, practical bun. And her body was large, round, with wide hips and strong arms that seemed capable of carrying the world. When Richard saw her for the first time, he almost rejected her on the spot. She wasn't the type of housekeeper he expected. His estate was modern, elegant, minimalist. Everything was white, grey, and black. Clean lines, polished surfaces. And Esther seemed taken from another era. Another reality entirely different. She wore a humble blue cotton dress, faded by years of washing, worn shoes that had seen better days, and she carried a small cardboard suitcase that seemed to be older than she was. Her presence contrasted with everything in the estate, but the agency had told him that she was the only one available at the moment, and Richard urgently needed someone to take care of the house while he worked. So he accepted, reluctantly, almost with disdain, but he accepted. He showed her the estate quickly. He explained the rules in a cold, distant voice. Do not touch his documents under any circumstances. Do not enter his personal office. Do not answer the phone. Do not open the door to anyone without his authorization. And most importantly of all, do not disturb Matthew under any circumstances. The boy had his own wing of the estate, his own medical team that came to check on him, his own nurses who came 3 times a week to make sure he was physically well. Esther should only clean the rooms, cook the meals, wash the clothes, and remain absolutely invisible. That was all Richard expected of her. The woman nodded silently as she listened to the instructions, her dark eyes, deep as bottomless wells, observed every corner of the estate without saying anything. She didn't ask questions. She didn't ask for clarifications. She didn't show any emotion. And then she simply started to work. The first few weeks were completely normal. Esther arrived early every morning, before Richard left for work. She cleaned every room with an almost obsessive dedication, leaving everything spotless. She cooked simple but delicious meals that she left in the refrigerator, perfectly labeled, and she disappeared before Richard arrived home from work at night. It was exactly what he had asked for, an invisible housekeeper, a presence that kept the house running without being noticed. Richard barely thought about her. She was simply another person on the long list of employees who passed through his life without leaving a trace. But then Richard began to notice strange things, small anomalies that caught his attention. First were the electricity bills. One night, reviewing the month's expenses as he always did, he noticed that the electricity bill had increased by 30% compared to the previous month. At first, he thought it was a mistake by the company, but when he reviewed the detailed records, he discovered something unusual. Someone was using electricity during the night, between 2 and 5 in the morning, lights on, appliances running, things that didn't make sense. Richard slept during those hours, and Matthew, according to the nurses, did too. So, who was awake at 3 in the morning using electricity in his estate? Then it was the food. One day, Richard opened the refrigerator looking for something to eat and noticed that things were missing. Milk, bread, fruits, leftovers from previous meals, small things, insignificant separately, but that added up. He checked the pantry and found the same thing, cans that had vanished, packages that were half empty, when he remembered them being full. At first, he thought he was just confused, that he'd forgotten what he'd bought. But Richard Sterling wasn't the kind of man who forgot things. He'd built an empire based on his attention to detail, and something wasn't right. Eventually, it came down to the money. Richard had a safe in his personal office, where he kept cash for emergencies, $10,000 exactly, always $10,000. One day, just by chance, he decided to check it, and $200 was missing. It wasn't much money, was for him. $200 was what he spent on a business lunch one, without a second thought. But it was the beginning of something he knew very well, the thief's pattern. Richard had seen this behavior hundreds of times in business. Dishonest employees always started small, testing the limits, seeing how far they could go without getting caught. 200 today, 2,000 next week, 20,000 the following month. It was an inevitable progression, and Richard knew exactly who was to blame. Esther. She was the only new person in the house, the only different variable in his perfectly controlled equation. The woman with the cardboard suitcase and the faded dress. The woman who had probably spent her entire life serving rich people and dreaming of having what they had. It was so obvious that Richard almost felt insulted by how predictable the situation was, but he wasn't going to confront her without proof, because if he accused her unfairly, she could sue him, she could go to the media, she could turn him into the racist millionaire who accused a poor African-American woman without evidence. Richard Sterling hadn't gotten where he was by being impulsive. He hadn't built an empire by making decisions based on assumptions. So, he decided to do what he did best: gather data, collect evidence, build an irrefutable case. That same week, he hired the best security company in the city. He paid them triple their normal rate to work quickly and with absolute discretion. In 2 days, his estate was equipped with a state-of-the-art hidden camera system, cameras in the kitchen, hidden in the smoke detectors, cameras in the hallways, disguised as motion sensors, cameras in the pantry, integrated into the shelves, cameras in the living room, hidden in the pots of the artificial plants. He even put a camera in the hallway, leading to Matthew's wing, not in the boys' room, because that seemed too invasive, even for him, but in the hallway, to see who was coming and going. The cameras had high-definition night vision, continuous recording, with cloud storage, and they connected directly to an app on his phone. Richard could see everything that was happening in his house, from anywhere in the world, in real time, in high resolution, with audio included. It was a perfect surveillance system, and now he just had to wait for Esther to fall into the trap. The first few nights, he didn't see anything unusual. Esther cleaned during the day, exactly as always. She left at 6 in the evening, as scheduled, and the estate fell into absolute silence. Richard reviewed the recordings every morning during breakfast, looking for any anomalies, but everything seemed normal. He began to think that maybe he'd been wrong. That, maybe, the missing money, had been a counting error. That maybe the disappearing food was just his imagination. But on the 4th night, everything changed. At 2:47 a.m. exactly, one of the cameras detected motion. Richard was in his downtown office, working on an urgent project that required his attention. An important client from Asia wanted to close a deal, and the time difference meant working late. When he saw the notification on his phone, his heart raced. Motion alert detected. Camera 7, East Wing hallway. He'd finally caught her. He opened the camera app. With hands trembling with anticipation, he found the camera that had detected the motion. It was the camera in the hallway, leading to Matthew's wing. And what he saw on the screen of his phone left him completely paralyzed. Esther was walking slowly down the dark hallway. The camera's night vision showed her in greenish tones, like a ghostly apparition in the darkness. She was wearing the same blue dress as always, but now she was also wearing yellow rubber gloves, the typical cleaning gloves, and she was carrying something in her hands very carefully. A plate. Richard adjusted the camera zoom to see better, his heart beating faster and faster. On the plate was what appeared to be soup and a piece of bread next to it. The woman walked to the door of Matthew's room with slow and measured steps. She stopped in front of the door. She looked to both sides of the hallway, as if checking that no one was watching her. Then she tapped softly 3 times, a specific pattern, as if it were an agreed-upon signal, and then she opened the door and entered his son's room. Richard felt the blood boiling in his veins. He had given her explicit instructions, absolutely clear, not to disturb his son, not to enter that wing of the estate, under any circumstances, and this woman had completely disobeyed him. Even worse, she was entering the room of a vulnerable, traumatized child at 3 in the morning. Who knows what she was doing in there? Who knows what her intentions were? Richard grabbed his phone furiously and started dialing the police number. He was going to report a break-in, an intrusion, possible child abuse. He was going to have this woman arrested and put in jail for the rest of her life. But then he stopped, his fingers hovering over the screen without pressing the call button, because he didn't have cameras inside Matthew's room. He didn't know what was really going on in there, and if he called the police, without concrete proof that something bad was happening. He might seem paranoid, he might scare his son, he might make everything worse. Besides, the police would ask questions, reporters would come, the story would be in the media. Millionaire calls police to arrest 65-year-old housekeeper. He could see the headlines. He could feel the damage to his reputation. No, he had to be smarter than that. He decided to wait, see what happened. When Esther came out of the room, if she tried to leave with something stolen, he'd confront her. If Matthew seemed upset, he'd act. But for now, he'd just observe. 10 minutes passed. Richard stared at the screen, unblinking. Matthew's door remained closed. 20 minutes. His coffee had gone completely cold. The documents from his Asian client lay forgotten on the desk. 30 minutes. Richard began to feel panic rising. What was this woman doing with his son for so long? All he could think about was Matthew, his helpless son, his child who couldn't ask for help even if he wanted to, because he couldn't speak. 40 minutes. Richard had already decided that if the door didn't open in the next 5 minutes, he was going to sprint from the office, drive like a madman back to the estate, and barge into that room, even if he had to break the door down. At precisely 3:42 a.m., the door finally opened. Richard held his breath. Esther walked out of the room slowly. But she wasn't carrying the plate anymore. Her hands were completely empty, and on her face, there was something Richard couldn't immediately identify. A strange expression. Complex. Like deep sadness mixed with something that looked like tenderness. The woman closed the bedroom door with exquisite care, without making the slightest sound. She stood in front of the closed door for several seconds, as if she were praying or meditating. And then she walked back down the hallway toward the kitchen. Her steps were slow, tired, as if she were carrying an invisible weight on her shoulders. She disappeared from the camera's view. Richard stared at his phone screen for several more minutes, waiting, thinking, analyzing. Something didn't fit at all. If Esther was stealing or doing something bad why did she look so sad? Thieves don't have that expression after they steal. Abusers don't walk like that after they inflict harm. He'd seen enough corporate interrogations to know how the guilty behave, and Esther didn't display any typical signs of guilt. There was something else here. Something Richard couldn't see from his phone screen, and he needed to find out what it was the next day. Richard arrived at the estate much earlier than usual. Normally, he didn't get back until 8 or 9 at night, but today, he arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Esther was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard him come in. She turned around surprised, a wooden spoon in her hand. "Mr. Sterling, I wasn't expecting you so early. Is everything all right?" Richard stared intently at her, studying every inch of her face, looking for signs of guilt, of nervousness, of deception. But he only saw the same tired eyes as always, eyes that had seen too much, eyes that carried stories he didn't know. "I had a meeting that was cancelled," he lied smoothly. "I'm going to work from home today." Esther nodded without asking any more questions and returned to her work in the kitchen. She didn't seem fazed by his unexpected presence. She didn't seem worried that he discovered her doing something wrong. She simply continued cooking as if nothing had happened. Richard went up to his office on the second floor, but he didn't work for even a single minute. Instead, he spent the entire day reviewing the camera footage from the last few weeks. He discovered that Esther had been going into Matthew's room every night for the last 2 whole weeks, always at the same approximate time. Between 2:30 and 3:00 a.m., always with a plate of food in her hands, soup, bread, fruit, warm milk, always staying between 30 minutes and a full hour, and always leaving with that same expression of sadness mixed with tenderness. Richard didn't understand any of it. The nurses who visited Matthew 3 times a week had never mentioned anything unusual about the boy. The psychologist who came regularly said that the boy was still not speaking, still showing no significant progress. Everything seemed completely normal during the day, but at night, something mysterious was happening. Something that only occurred in the darkness, something that Richard couldn't see or understand. He decided he needed more information before acting. That afternoon, while Esther was busy cleaning the second floor of the estate, Richard quietly went down to Matthew's room. He knocked gently on the door with his knuckles. No response. As always, he went in anyway, pushing the door open slowly. His son was sitting on the bed, looking out the window at the garden. As always, exactly the same as every day since Caroline's funeral. "Hey, champ," Richard said in the softest voice he could manage. "How are you doing today?" Matthew didn't respond. He didn't even turn his head to look at him. Richard felt the same pain as always, stabbing at his chest. That terrible emptiness that never went away no matter how much time passed. He sat on the bed next to his son. He looked around the room for something different, some change that would explain what was going on. And then he saw it. On the nightstand next to the bed, there was an empty plate. The same kind of plate he had seen in the recordings, and next to the plate, a drawing. Richard picked up the drawing with hands that were trembling uncontrollably. It was a drawing done with crayons. Simple, childlike, imperfect. But what it showed made his heart stop completely for a second. The drawing showed a large woman with dark skin, drawn with a brown crayon. She had white hair, done with a silver crayon. And from her mouth came colorful musical notes. The woman was singing. Next to the woman, there was a small boy, drawn very carefully. And the boy had something on his face that Richard hadn't seen in months, a smile. The boy in the drawing was smiling, while listening to the woman sing. Richard stared at the drawing for several eternal seconds, his eyes filling with tears. His son hadn't drawn anything since his mother's death. Nothing. The therapists had tried everything for months. Crayons, colored pencils, paints, Play-Doh. Any form of artistic expression they could imagine. Matthew refused to create anything. He would stare at the materials without touching them, as if he didn't understand what they were for. And now, suddenly, without any professional intervention, he had made a drawing of Esther, a drawing where he, Matthew, was smiling. "Who is she?" Richard asked in a trembling voice, pointing to the woman in the drawing. Matthew didn't respond with words, but for the first time in what felt like an endless 8 months, he slowly turned his head to look at his father, and in his eyes, there was something Richard hadn't seen since Caroline's funeral. Life, a tiny, but undeniable spark of life. That night, Richard didn't go to his downtown office. He stayed at the estate, waiting, silently, watching. At 11 o'clock, he turned off all the lights in his room and pretended to be sound asleep. At exactly 2:30 in the morning, he heard soft footsteps in the hallway. He got out of bed without a sound, walked barefoot to his bedroom door, and opened it just a crack. He saw Esther walking towards Matthew's wing with her characteristic slow gait. She was carrying the same old plate. This time it seemed to be chicken noodle soup, with a slice of homemade bread on the side. Richard waited for her to enter his son's room, and then, very slowly, holding his breath, he followed her down the dark hallway. Matthew's door was ajar. A thin line of dim light escaped through the crack. Richard approached without making the slightest noise, moving his feet with extreme care on the hardwood floor. He positioned himself by the door and peered through the opening. What he saw in the next few minutes changed his life forever. Esther was sitting on the cold floor of the room, next to Matthew's bed. Not in a chair, not on the edge of the bed. On the floor. as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The boy was awake, sitting up in bed with his legs crossed and his eyes wide open. He wasn't staring into space like he did during the day. He was looking directly at Esther, attentively, with interest, with something that resembled affection. And Esther was singing. It was a soft song, an old melody that Richard didn't recognize. But that seemed strangely familiar, like a lullaby that had survived entire generations, like something that existed before there were even words to describe it. Esther's voice was deep and warm, profound, rich, like the sound of rain falling softly on an old tin roof, like the murmur of a river running between ancient stones. It was a voice that spoke directly to the soul, bypassing the mind. And as she sang, Esther held Matthew's hand in hers. The woman's large or wrinkled hands completely enveloped the boy's small hand, and Matthew didn't pull away, didn't tense up, didn't show any sign of discomfort. On the contrary, the boy stared at her, unblinking, completely absorbed in the song, as if those notes were oxygen, and he had been drowning for months. Richard had never seen his son so focused on anything, so present in the moment, so unbelievably alive. The song ended softly, the last notes fading into the silence of the night. Esther smiled, a smile full of genuine love. "Now eat your soup, sweetheart," she said in a sweet maternal voice. "You need to be strong to face the day tomorrow." And then something happened that Richard had stopped believing was possible. Matthew took the spoon that was in the bowl. He took it himself, without help, without anyone guiding his hand. And he began to eat, spoonful after spoonful, slurp after slurp, chewing the bread with real appetite, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Richard had to cover his mouth with both hands to keep from making noise. Tears began to fall down his face uncontrollably. His son hadn't eaten on his own since his mother's death. The nurses had to feed him. They had to put the spoon in his mouth because he wouldn't do it himself. The doctors were seriously concerned about his weight. They had talked about intravenous feeding if things didn't improve. And now that's at 3 in the morning, in secret. Matthew was eating soup as if he had never stopped. Esther watched him with a sad, beautiful smile. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she said, as the boy ate. "Very proud." Matthew stopped eating for a moment, slowly lowered the spoon to the bowl, looked at Esther with those big, expressive eyes that he had inherited from Caroline, and then, for the first time in 8 months of absolute silence, he opened his mouth and spoke. "She sang that song," the boy said in a small, fragile voice, weakened by disuse. "My mom sang that song." Richard had to sit down on the floor of the hallway. His legs couldn't hold him up anymore. His son had spoken. After 8 endless months of total silence, of failed therapy sessions, of baffled specialists, of nights of desperation, he had said a complete sentence. And it hadn't been thanks to any expensive treatment. It had been thanks to a 65-year-old African-American housekeeper who sang at 3 in the morning. Esther nodded slowly at the boy's words. "I know, sweetheart. I know. That's why I sing it for you, so you never forget it, so you can always hear it when you need it." "How do you know my mum's song?" Matthew asked with genuine curiosity. Esther smiled with infinite tenderness. "Because all the mothers in the world know that song, sweetheart. It's the song we sing when our children are afraid, when they're sad, when they feel like the world is too big and dark. It's the song that reminds us that we're not alone, that we're never alone." Matthew looked down at his half-finished bowl of soup. His expression changed, became more serious, more fragile. "I miss my mom a lot," he said in a small voice that was barely audible. "I miss her every day. I know, sweetheart. I miss mine too, and my children, and all those who are no longer with me." Esther took Matthew's hand in hers again. But they don't really leave, you know. They never leave completely. She touched the boy's chest with her other hand, right over his heart. They stay here, in your heart. And every time you remember their song, every time you think of her with love, she's with you. She'll always be with you. Until the last day of your life. Matthew looked at Esther for a long, silent moment. His eyes sparkled with tears that didn't fall. And then he did something that Richard never in his life would have imagined. He got out of bed slowly, walked the few steps that separated him from Esther, and hugged her with all the strength of his 8 years, clung to her as if she were a lifeline in the middle of the ocean, and Esther held him, cradled him in her large, soft, warm arms, rocked him like you rock a baby, and she began to sing again. That same song. That same ancient melody that had journeyed through time. And Matthew closed his eyes. He stopped fighting. He stopped resisting. He stopped hiding from the world. And he let himself be lulled. As if finally, after 8 months of constant nightmares, he had found a safe place to rest. Richard slid down the hallway wall until he was sitting on the cold floor. Tears fell uncontrollably down his face. He didn't try to stop them. He couldn't believe what he was witnessing. This woman, this housekeeper, this person he had judged by her appearance, this person he had wanted to fire and have arrested, had achieved in 2 weeks what the best specialists in the world had failed to achieve in 8 whole months. She had given him back his son. She had lit a light in the darkness. Richard sat there in the dark hallway, crying silently, until Esther finally came out of the room. When the woman opened the door and saw him sitting on the floor with his face soaked in tears, she stopped dead in her track, her face filled with genuine fear. "Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry. I know you told me not to go into the boys' room. I know I disobeyed your instruction, but he needed..." Richard slowly got up from the floor. His legs were still shaking. His eyes were red and swollen. He stood in front of Esther in the dark hallway, and in a voice broken by emotion, he asked the only question that mattered. "How did you do it? How did you get my son to speak again?" Esther lowered her gaze to the floor, as if feeling ashamed. "I didn't do anything special, Mr. Sterling. I just listened to him." "What do you mean by that?" "The first week I came to this house, I saw him looking out of the window, hours and hours looking outside without moving. And I saw something in his eyes that I recognized immediately." "What thing?" "The same pain I had when I lost my husband many years ago, and then when I lost my children." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "You lost your children?" Esther nodded slowly, without looking up. "I had 3. 2 boys and a girl. They all died in a bus accident 15 years ago. They were going to school like every morning. The driver fell asleep at the wheel. The bus went over a cliff. There were no survivors." Richard didn't know what to say. There were no words to respond to something like that. "I also stopped talking after that," Esther continued in a quiet voice. "For almost a whole year. I couldn't do it. The words wouldn't come out of my mouth. It was as if my throat had closed forever, as if my body refused to participate in a world where my children no longer existed." "What helped you to speak again?" "A neighbor, an old woman who lived alone in the house next door. She had lost her husband and her 2 brothers in a flood many years before. She knew the pain like I knew it." Esther finally looked up to look at Richard. "She came to my house every night. She sat next to my bed. She didn't talk to me. She didn't give me advice. She didn't tell me I had to be strong or that time would heal my wounds. She just sang. The same songs that I sang to my children when they were little. And she reminded me that I wasn't alone, that someone understood my pain without needing words." Esther looked towards the closed door of Matthew's room. "She didn't tell me that I had to get over it. She didn't pressure me. She was just there, night after night, until one day, without thinking about it. I answered her. I started singing with her, and the words came back. And that's why you sang for my son? Esther nodded. One night, I heard him crying. It was almost 3 in the morning. I couldn't sleep like many nights, and I heard him. He was crying very softly, so that no one would hear him, so as not to bother anyone. But I heard him, and I knew exactly how he felt, because I had cried like that many nights after losing my children. Why didn't you tell me anything? Why did you keep it a secret all this time? Because you told me clearly not to bother him. And because, Esther paused, searching for the right words. Because I knew you wouldn't believe me, that you would think I was crazy, or that I wanted to get something, or worse, that I was doing something wrong with your son. Richard lowered his head, overwhelmed with shame. She was absolutely right. He had thought exactly that. He had assumed the worst without any real evidence. He had installed cameras as if it were a criminal investigation. He had planned to fire her and have her arrested. And all this time, while he watched her with suspicion, she had been saving his son, song by song, night by night, with infinite patience. Esther, Richard said with a trembling voice that he barely recognized as his own, I need you to forgive me. Forgive you. Why? For everything. For treating you like a criminal. For watching you with cameras as if you were a thief. For judging you by your appearance without knowing you. For not seeing what you really were. Esther smiled with a soft sadness. You don't have to apologize, Mr. Sterling. You were just protecting your son. Any father would do the same. A father's love sometimes looks like distrust. I understand. But I was completely wrong. In everything. Absolutely in everything. Richard looked Esther directly in the eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't see a housekeeper. He didn't see a poor woman. He didn't see someone insignificant who cleaned his house. He saw a mother who had lost everything she loved, and still had found the strength to move on. A mother who used her pain to heal the pain of others. A mother who had nothing and gave everything. How did you know the specific song? Richard asked. The song that my wife sang to Matthew. Esther smiled. I didn't know it. I had no idea what it was. Then how? The first night I went into your son's room, he had a picture of his mom clutched against his chest, and he was humming something, very softly, almost inaudible, but I heard him. Richard felt a lump in his throat. I asked him if he wanted me to sing with him. Esther continued, I didn't speak. I just made the gesture of singing, and he nodded his head. So I started humming the same thing as him, following his melody, imitating the sounds he made. And little by little, night after night, I was learning the complete song. Matthew taught you the song, yes, without words, without explanations, only with sounds and gestures, but each night he taught me a little more, and I added the lyrics that I felt fit. The words that my heart told me belonged to that melody. Richard couldn't believe what he was hearing. Her son, who hadn't spoken a word in 8 months, who psychologists had declared completely closed off to communication, had been communicating with Esther through music. He had found a way to express his pain, to share his inner world, without having to use words. And Esther had been wise enough, patient enough, loving enough, to listen in that way. Tonight, he said his first complete word out loud. Richard announced, he hasn't spoken to anyone in 8 months. I know, Esther replied softly. That's why I was crying when I left the room. You were crying too, Richard asked, surprised. All these years, since I lost my children, I've sung that song, and others like it, to children who aren't mine, in the homes of families where I worked, with neighbors who needed comfort, trying to fill the huge void that Charles, Eddie, and Rosie left behind. Esther dabbed at a tear that had escaped down her cheek. But none of those children had responded like Matthew. I've never felt like I was truly making a difference until tonight. Tonight, when he spoke, I knew my children were proud of me. I knew all the pain had been worth it. Yes, Richard slowly approached her. I don't want you to leave, he said with a firm voice. I want you to stay in this house, not as an employee, as part of this family. Esther looked at him with genuine surprise. Mr. Sterling, I can't. My son needs you, and I think I need you too. This estate has been empty since Caroline died, filled with expensive things, but completely empty of life, empty of love, empty of everything that matters. And you brought something I didn't know I needed so desperately. What's that? She asked gently. Hope. Esther looked down at her wrinkled hands. I'm nobody special, Mr. Sterling. I'm just an old woman who knows how to listen, who knows pain, and isn't afraid of it. That's exactly what we need, and Richard said. Someone who knows how to really listen, someone who understands without judging, someone who isn't afraid to sit on the cold floor at 3 in the morning and sing to a broken child. Richard took Esther's hands in his. Please, he said, stay with us. Esther looked at his hands holding hers, the hands of a tech mogul, of a man who had all the power in the world and who was now begging a housekeeper not to leave him. The world was strange, unpredictable, filled with unexpected turns. 15 years ago, Esther had lost everything she loved in a bus accident. She had thought her life had ended that day, that she was just waiting her turn to depart. But now she understood she was wrong. Her life hadn't ended. It had just taken a different path, a path that had led her to this estate, to this injured boy, to this new opportunity to love. All right, Esther said finally. I'll stay. The following weeks were the happiest Richard Sterling had experienced since Caroline's death. Matthew began to speak more, with each passing day. First, they were single words. Water, hungry, tired, thank you. Then short sentences. I want more soup. I like this song. Good morning, Grandma. Grandma. That's what he had started calling Esther, without anyone asking him to. And finally, complete conversations, stories about his day, questions about the world, laughter at silly jokes. The doctors and psychologists couldn't believe the transformation. The child they had diagnosed with severe mutism, whom they had declared almost hopeless, now spoke non-stop. He told made-up stories about dragons and castles, asked questions about the stars and planets, laughed wholeheartedly when Esther made funny voices, and it had all started with a song, at 3 in the morning. Esther moved permanently into a room in the estate. Richard insisted that she have her own space worthy of her, her own television, her own full bathroom, new furniture chosen especially for her comfort. But Esther was hardly ever in that room. She spent most of her time with Matthew. Together they baked chocolate chip cookies, filling the kitchen with sweet aromas. They watched animated movies, curled up on the large sofa. They played in the garden, chasing imaginary butterflies, and every night, without fail. Esther went to Matthew's room to sing him the song before bed. It was their sacred ritual, their special moment that no one interrupted. And Richard watched them from the half-open door, with silent tears in his eyes, thanking the universe for sending this extraordinary woman into their lives. One day, Richard was in his office in the estate, reviewing some old security camera recordings. He no longer used them to watch over anyone. He used them to remember, to see those magical 3 a.m. moments. That had changed absolutely everything. And while he watched the recordings nostalgically, he discovered something he hadn't noticed before. On one of the first nights, Esther had entered Matthew's room with more than just food. She was carrying a book under her arm, Richard adjusted the zoom on the recording to better see the title. It wasn't a book. It was a photo album. An old, worn album that Esther had brought from her own home. Richard immediately went to find Esther and asked her about the album. She smiled softly and took it from a drawer in her room. "It's my greatest treasure," she said as she opened it reverently. "The only thing I have left of them." Inside were old photos, yellowed by the passage of time, stained by tears shed many years ago. Photos of 3 smiling children, 2 boys of different ages and a small girl with braids. "My children," Esther said, and pointing to each one. "Charles, my oldest. Eddie, the middle one. And Rosie, my princess." Richard looked at the photos in respectful silence. The children looked happy, full of life and hope, completely unaware of the terrible fate that awaited them. "Did you show these photos to Matthew?" Richard asked softly. "Yes," Esther said. "I told him about each of them, about what they were like, about the things they liked, about their dreams and their fears, and about how they died." "Why?" Richard asked, concerned. "Because I wanted him to know that he wasn't alone in his pain, that other people had also lost those they loved with all their hearts, and that even so. Somehow, they kept going, they kept singing, they kept living, they kept finding reasons to wake up every morning." Richard closed the album with infinite care. "Esther," he said, his voice filled with gratitude, "I need to ask you something else, Esther. Something that's been bothering me." "Go ahead, Mr. Sterling." "The missing money from my safe. The $200. Was it you who took it?" Esther lowered her gaze to her hands, clearly ashamed. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. It was me. I'm so sorry. I have no excuse." Richard said nothing. He simply waited for her to explain. Esther sighed deeply. "My neighbor, Mrs. Johnson. The woman who helped me when I lost my children. She's been very sick for months. She lives alone and has no family to take care of her. She doesn't have money for her medicine because her pension barely covers food." She paused, fighting back tears. "I wanted to help her. I wanted to pay her back for even a little of what she did for me. But my salary wasn't enough. And one day I was cleaning your study, and I saw the safe open, and I saw all that money there, and I thought you'd never notice. That $200 wouldn't mean anything to someone like you. Why didn't you just ask me for the money directly?" Esther looked at him with eyes full of old sorrow. "Mr. Sterling, in my whole life, no one has ever given me anything without expecting something in return. I've worked since I was 10 years old. I've cleaned houses for rich people who wouldn't even look me in the eye, who treated me like I was part of the furniture. Asking is very difficult when your whole life you've been taught that you don't deserve anything, that you don't have the right to ask." Richard felt a deep ache in his chest, not because of the stolen money, because of the injustice, because of the whole cruel system that had made such an extraordinarily valuable woman like Esther feel so small and insignificant. "How much does your neighbor need for her medicine and complete treatment?" he asked. Esther looked at him, confused by the question. "You don't have to worry about that, Mr. Sterling. I'll find a way to—" "How much, Esther?" "The doctors say that the complete treatment for her illness costs about $15,000, but she only has a few hundred saved. That's why she only buys the most urgent medicines and prays that it's enough." Richard took out his phone and opened his banking app without hesitating for a second. "What's your neighbor's full name?" "Margaret Johnson." "Mrs. Margaret Johnson. Everyone calls her that." Richard typed quickly on his phone, his fingers moving with determination. "Okay," he said after a few seconds. "I just transferred $50,000 to your personal account. $15,000 is for Mrs. Johnson's complete treatment, and the rest, the remaining $35,000, is for you, so that you never have to steal to help someone you love." Esther was completely paralyzed. Her eyes widened. Her mouth trembled. "Mr. Sterling, I can't accept that. It's too much. It's..." It's not a question, Esther. I'm not asking for your permission. It's the least I can do for the woman who saved my son, for the woman who brought the light back into this house. Esther started to cry, but they weren't tears of sadness, like she had shed so many times in her life. They were tears of something she had almost forgotten how it felt. Genuine gratitude, deep relief, renewed hope. Richard hugged her. And in that hug, two people broken by life found a little of the healing they both needed so desperately. 6 months after Esther's arrival, the Sterling estate was completely unrecognizable. Not physically. It still had the same 32 rooms and 4 pools and huge garden, but the energy was absolutely different. There was genuine laughter in the hallways, cheerful music in the kitchen, the aroma of freshly baked cookies floating everywhere, real life in every corner. Matthew had returned to school after months of absence. His teachers couldn't believe the radical change in him. The quiet, sad child who stared into space was now one of the most participatory in the whole class. He made friends easily, told jokes that made everyone laugh, raised his hand to answer questions. He had even started taking guitar lessons because he wanted to learn how to play his mom's song. And all because an extraordinary woman had sat on the floor to sing with him in the darkness of the night. Richard had also changed profoundly. He no longer worked 18 hours a day like a soulless machine. He came home early to have dinner with his son and Esther. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, not in the formal, huge and cold dining room, and talked about their days. Matthew told what he had learned at school. Esther shared new recipes she wanted to try. Richard talked about his projects in a way that his family could understand. It was simple. It was ordinary. It was what millions of families did every night. And it was the most valuable thing Richard had had in many years. One autumn afternoon, Richard came home and found Matthew in the backyard. The boy was kneeling next to a rose bush, his hands covered in dirt, planting something very carefully. "What are you doing, champ?" Richard asked, approaching with curiosity. Matthew turned to look at him with a huge smile that lit up his whole face. "I'm planting a tree, Dad. Grandma Esther says that when you plant a tree, a part of you lives forever. Even if you leave, the tree keeps growing. And everyone who sees it remembers who planted it." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Grandma Esther." "That's what I call her now," Matthew said naturally. "Because she's like my grandma. But better. Because she's here with me every day. Because she sings to me every night. Because she loves me even though she doesn't have to." Richard looked towards the house and saw Esther watching them from the kitchen window. The woman smiled warmly and waved. Richard waved back. And in that perfect moment, he understood something that had taken him too long to learn. Family is not defined by the blood that runs through your veins. It's defined by who is there when you need them most, by who sits by your side in the darkest moments and sings until the light returns. That weekend, Richard hosted a special dinner at the estate. He invited Mrs. Johnson, Esther's neighbor, who was already completely recovered thanks to the complete medical treatment he had paid for. He invited the doctors and psychologists who had treated Matthew during the difficult months. He invited some close employees of his company who had become friends. And he also invited something intangible but powerful that he hadn't had in a long time: hope for the future. During dinner, as everyone enjoyed the feast Esther had lovingly prepared, Richard stood up and asked for everyone's attention. "I have something important to say," he began, his voice clear. 9 months ago, my life was utterly destroyed. I had lost my Caroline. My son had stopped speaking, and I was so consumed by my own grief that I couldn't see anything beyond my tears." He looked directly at Esther, who was sitting modestly at the end of the table. "And then, a woman came to my house, a woman I immediately judged. For her appearance, buddy, for her age, for her simple clothes, for the color of her skin, for everything the world had taught me to despise." He paused, struggling to control his emotion. "I even installed secret cameras in my own home to catch her. I was absolutely convinced she was doing something wrong, because that's what I'd been taught my entire life. That people like her are always up to no good. That you have to distrust them. That you have to watch them. Esther lowered her gaze to her plate, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. But Richard continued. And what those cameras recorded destroyed all my false beliefs. They recorded a woman sitting on the cold floor at 3 in the morning, singing to my broken son. They recorded pure, unconditional love. They recorded real healing. They recorded everything that money can never buy. Richard walked to where Esther was sitting and knelt beside her chair. Esther Brown, you are not my housekeeper. You are my family. You are my son's grandmother. And if you'll allow it, I'd like to make that completely official. He pulled a white envelope from his pocket. I've been talking to my lawyers for weeks. If you sign these papers, you will legally be part of the Sterling family forever. You will have access to everything we have, a complete legal protection. And when I die someday, you will inherit alongside Matthew, like my own mother. Esther looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mr. Sterling, I don't need any of that. I just need... I know perfectly well, Richard interrupted. I know you don't need anything material. That's exactly why I'm giving you everything. Because the people who never ask for anything are precisely the ones who deserve everything. Matthew got up from his chair and ran to where his father and Esther were. Say yes, Miss Grandma, please say yes. Esther looked at the boy, whom she had come to love as if he were her own grandson. Then she looked at Richard, who was offering her something she had never had in 65 years of life, a permanent place, a real family, a home where she belonged. And finally, she looked up at the ceiling, towards where she imagined her children were, Charles with his mischievous smile, Eddie with his curious eyes, Rosie with her perfect braids. She had always thought her life had ended when they died in that bus accident, that she was just existing, not living, patiently waiting her turn to reunite with them. But now she understood that she was completely wrong. Her life hadn't ended that terrible day. It had just taken a different path, one she couldn't see at the time, a long and painful path that had eventually led her to this estate, to this wounded boy who needed exactly what she could give, to this family that needed her as much as she needed them. Yes, she said finally, her voice trembling. I accept. Matthew screamed with pure joy and hugged her with all his might. Richard smiled, tears falling freely down his face, and all the guests applauded with genuine emotion. Donna Mercedes wiped her tears with a napkin. The doctors smiled in amazement. It was a moment of perfect happiness. But the most important moment of that night was not the signing of the legal papers. It was what happened much later, when all the guests had left and the house had fallen silent. Matthew was already sound asleep in his bed, with a smile on his face. Richard and Esther were in the kitchen, washing the dishes together in comfortable silence. The water ran smoothly. The dishes clinked. It was a simple, domestic moment, ordinary, perfect. Thank you, Richard said finally, for absolutely everything. Esther smiled as she dried a plate with a dish towel. You don't have to thank me for anything, Mr. Sterling. I should be the one thanking you. Why do you say that? For giving me a reason to keep living. Richard stopped washing dishes and looked at her intently. When I came to this house 9 months ago, I was very tired, Esther said in a calm voice. Tired of life, tired of being alone, tired of waking up every morning, wondering what I was still existing for. She paused, her hands still on the plate she was drying. But then I saw Matthew that first week, and I saw in his eyes exactly the same pain that I know so intimately well. And I thought something simple but powerful. I thought, if I can help this child, even just a little bit, then my life still has some meaning. There's still a reason to wake up tomorrow. Esther put the plate in its place on the shelf. And it turns out that by helping him, I unknowingly helped myself. It turns out that love works in that mysterious way. The more you give without expecting anything in return, the more you have inside you, the more you empty yourself to fill others, the fuller you feel. Richard nodded slowly in silence. My wife Caroline used to say something very similar, he said after a moment. She said that love is like a lit candle. You can use that candle to light 1,000 more candles, and the original flame never goes out. It never gets smaller. It just creates more light. Esther smiled in recognition. Your wife was very wise, a special woman. She was. She was the most special person I've ever known, and I'm absolutely sure that she would have loved you very much. I think you would have been great friends. Esther looked out the kitchen window at the dark garden, where she could barely see the silhouette of the small tree that Matthew had planted. I think she sent me here, she said in a very low voice. I think that from where she is, she saw that her son needed someone specific, someone who understood his pain, and somehow she put me on the right path to get to you. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He was not a particularly religious man. He didn't believe in angel, or divine interventions, or signs from the universe. But there was something deeply true in Esther's words, something he couldn't explain with logic, but also couldn't deny with honesty. Maybe you're right, he said finally. Maybe Caroline did send you. Maybe she's watching over us, in a way we can't see. Esther nodded softly. Or maybe it was just coincidence, a twist of fate. It doesn't really matter what the explanation is. What matters is that we're here now, the three of us, together. And that's more than I ever thought I'd have at 65. Richard smiled. And it's more than I ever thought I'd have at 45. They sat in silence for several minutes, gazing out the kitchen window together. The full moon illuminated the garden with a silvery light. The little tree that Matthew had planted was just a fragile sprig, swaying in the wind. But someday, if they took good care of it, it would be big and strong. It would provide shade on hot days. It would bear sweet fruit, like the family they had built together. From nothing, a tech mogul who had learned that money can't buy what really matters. A woman who had lost everything and found a second chance to love. And a boy who had stopped speaking and had found his voice again. 3 broken people who together had created something whole, something beautiful, something worth more than all the estates and all the fortunes in the world. And it all started with a song at 3 in the morning. A year later, Richard was invited to give a keynote speech at a very important business conference. The official topic was business leadership. But Richard didn't talk about business strategies, or impressive numbers, or market projections. He talked about Esther. He told the whole story in front of hundreds of people. The security cameras he had installed, the biases he had, the shame he now felt, the magical revelation at 3 in the morning. He told how he had judged an extraordinary woman by her appearance, and almost lost the greatest gift of his entire life. And when he finished speaking, the auditorium was in absolute silence. Hundreds of successful business executives, used to talking about money and power and competition, had tears in their eyes. Richard looked towards the front row of the auditorium, where Matthew and Esther were sitting. Matthew, who was now 9.5 years old, was enthusiastically gesturing that he had done a great job. And Esther was simply smiling, with that warm smile that Richard had learned to recognize as pure love. Richard ended his speech with a question that left everyone thinking. How many Esthers are there in your lives right now? He asked, looking at the audience. How many extraordinary people have you judged without taking the time to get to know them? How many incredible opportunities have you missed by letting yourselves be guided by prejudices that someone taught you? He paused for a long time, to let the words sink in. I'm asking you for one thing today. Just one thing. When you leave here, look at people in a completely different way, especially those who seem insignificant at first glance, those whom the world ignores, those who have no power or influence or money, Because maybe, just maybe, one of them is exactly the angel you've been waiting for your whole life. The entire auditorium applauded on their feet for several minutes, but Richard wasn't really listening to the applause. He was only listening to his son's voice, who was shouting excitedly from the front row. "That's my dad. Dad! And that's my Grandma Esther. And I love you both so much." And that, Richard thought, as tears streamed down his smiling face, was the only applause that really mattered in the entire universe. 3 years after Esther came to the estate, Matthew turned 11. He was no longer the broken, silent boy who stared out the window without seeing. He was a young man full of energy and life. He played the guitar with natural talent. He had many loyal friends. He got excellent grades in school. And every night, without any exception, he went to his Grandma Esther's room to give her a goodnight kiss and to listen to a song. It was their sacred ritual, their special moment that nothing in the world interrupted. Sometimes they sang together the old songs that she had taught him. Sometimes they simply talked about their days. Sometimes they just sat in silence, enjoying each other's company. Esther was now 68 years old. Her steps were a little slower than before. Her hands trembled slightly sometimes, but her heart was still exactly the same, big as the sky, generous as the sea, infinite as a mother's love. One day in spring, Matthew asked Esther a question that he had wanted to ask for a long time. "Grandma, how did you manage to go on after losing your children? How did you survive something so horrible?" Esther looked at him with infinite tenderness. "It wasn't easy at all, honey. There were many days when I didn't want to wake up. Days when the pain was so enormous that I couldn't even breathe. Days when I thought it would be better to just stop existing. So how did you do it? What gave you strength?" Esther smiled with a mixture of sadness and peace. "One day, many months after the accident, I made a very important decision. I decided that every day that I continued to live, I would live it for them, in their honor, in their memory. Every time I helped someone, it would be in the name of my kids. Every song I sang would be to remember them and keep them alive in my heart." She paused, looking out the window towards the flowering garden. And one day, without realizing when it happened exactly, the pain turned into something different. It never disappeared, because true love never disappears completely, but it transformed. It became strength when I felt weak, into purpose when I felt lost, into a reason to keep going when everything seemed pointless. Matthew nodded slowly, processing the words. "It's exactly what I feel with my mom," he said after a moment. "Before, it hurt so much to think about her. The pain was like a knife in my chest, but now, when I think about her, I feel good. Like she's close. Like she's giving me a very long hug from very far away." Esther took Matthew's hand between hers with delicacy. "That's precisely what she's doing, honey. Exactly that. Your mom never really left. She just changed shape. Now she's the wind that moves the leaves. She's the sun that warms your face. She's the song that plays in your heart when you need her." Matthew smiled and hugged his grandmother. And in that hug, two souls who had known the deepest pain found solace and peace once more. 5 years after Esther arrived at the estate, something started to change slowly. It wasn't anything dramatic or sudden. There was no crisis or emergency. Simply, little by little, Esther started getting tired more easily, sleeping more hours during the day, walking slower through the hallways, forgetting little things she used to remember perfectly. Richard took her to the best hospital in the city for every possible test. The results confirmed what everyone feared in silence. Esther's heart was failing. Years of hard work, of stress, of pain, of losses had taken their toll. She had, according to the doctors, a few months left at most. When Esther received the news, she didn't cry a single tear. She just smiled serenely. and said something that left everyone absolutely speechless. "My children have been waiting for me for a long time up there. It's time to finally go see them. But we need you here." "Grandma," said Matthew, who was now 13 years old and almost as tall as his father, "you can't leave yet." Esther looked at him with all the infinite love in the universe. "I'm going to be here forever, sweetheart, just in a different way than you know." She touched Matthew's chest right over his heart. "In here, in your heart, where my song is going to live eternally, where I'll never, never, never leave." The last months of Esther's life were, paradoxically, the happiest she'd lived in decades, not because she wasn't afraid of dying, because she was, like any human being, but because she was completely surrounded by genuine love. Richard reduced his work to the absolute minimum, to spend every possible moment with her. Matthew read her books every afternoon, carefully choosing stories he knew she'd enjoy. Miss Mercedes, who was now completely healthy and full of energy, came to visit her every week without fail, and every night, the three of them, Richard, Matthew, and Ms. Mercedes, sat together in Esther's room, and she sang the same old song and that ancient melody that had crossed generations and continents. Only now, Matthew sang with her in perfect harmony, and Richard had also learned the lyrics and added his voice. Three different voices united in the darkness of the night, remembering everything they had lived through, celebrating the love they shared, preparing for the inevitable farewell. One November night, as the winter cold began to creep in, Esther called Richard and Matthew to her room. She was lying in her bed with white sheets, weak, but still smiling. "I need to ask you something very important," she said, with a soft but clear voice. "Anything at Grandma," said Matthew, holding her hand. "When I'm gone. I don't want you to be sad for long. I want you to celebrate." "How are we going to celebrate if you're not going to be with us?" asked Richard, his voice breaking. Esther smiled with absolute peace. "You're going to celebrate everything beautiful we lived together, every song we sang, every laugh we shared, every moment in the kitchen baking cookies, every magical night at 3 a.m, when all this started years ago." She looked at Richard with eyes full of gratitude. "Promise me, you won't let my death destroy. You thought you already know perfectly well how to get out of the deepest pain. You did it once when you lost Caroline. You have the tools. You have the strength. You can do it again." Richard nodded, with tears running down his face. "I promise you, Esther. I promise you. And you." "Sweetheart," said Esther, looking at Matthew with infinite love, "promise me you're going to keep singing our song all your life, that you're going to teach it to your children when you have them, and to your grandchildren after them, so that it never, never gets lost, so that there's always someone in the world singing our melody." Matthew nodded, his face soaked with tears. "I promise you, Grandma. I promise you with all my heart." Esther closed her eyes slowly and sighed with complete peace. "Then I'm ready," she said, in a barely audible voice. "I'm ready to go see Carlos, Eduardo, and Rosita. They're waiting for me with open arms." Esther Brown died that same November night, peacefully, without any pain, surrounded by love, with one hand held firmly by Richard, and the other hand held just as firmly by Matthew, and with a serene smile on her face that remained even after she stopped breathing. Esther Brown's funeral was not a sad and gloomy event. It was exactly what she had asked for, a celebration of her extraordinary life. Richard rented the largest event hall he could find and filled it completely with bright yellow flowers, Esther's favorite color. He invited all the people Esther had helped and touched throughout her 68 years of life, and there turned out to be many, more, than he had ever imagined. There were former employers from decades past who told touching stories of how Esther had cared for their children with maternal love. There were neighbors from all the places she had lived, who remembered her infinite generosity and her willingness to always help. There were entire families, some who traveled from very far away, who said that Esther had changed there. lives, in ways they could never fully explain. And in the center of it all, and standing in front of hundreds of people, was Matthew, the boy who didn't speak, who was now 13 years old, almost as tall as his father, and walked onto the stage with his guitar in hand. "I'm going to sing a song," he said, and with a firm and clear voice that didn't tremble. "It's a very special song. My grandma Esther taught it to me 5 years ago, when I couldn't speak, and she helped me find my voice." He looked up at the ceiling of the hall. "Well, actually, I taught her the melody, and she put the perfect words to it. So I guess we created it together. She and I. It's our song." He adjusted his guitar. "This is for you, Grandma Esther, and for my mom Caroline, and for Carlos, Eduardo, and Rosita, and for all of those who are watching us from above, with love." And he began to play and to sing. The same old song, the ancient melody that had saved his life 5 years ago, the song that a wise woman had used to heal a broken child, and the whole hall, hundreds of people of all ages, sang with him. The voices joined in an imperfect but beautiful chorus, remembering a woman who had arrived at an estate as a simple housekeeper and had left this world as a queen, loved by all. 10 years after Esther's death, Richard Sterling was known throughout the country for the Esther Brown Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping domestic workers. He gave them education, legal support, medical assistance, and above all, he gave them dignity. Matthew, who was now 23 years old, was the director of programs at the foundation. He had studied psychology, inspired by his own healing. And now, he dedicated his life to helping other children who had suffered losses. One night, he received a case. A 7-year-old boy named Ethan, who had stopped talking after losing his mother. Matthew smiled as he read the report. He knew this story perfectly. He called the father and asked him just one question. "Does Ethan have a favorite song, one that his mom used to sing to him?" The father said yes. "Perfect," said Matthew. "Teach me the song, and trust me, because it works." And so, the chain of love continued, generation after generation, song after song. 20 years later, Richard Sterling passed away at the age of 70. In his will, he asked to be buried next to Esther, united forever. Matthew, who was now 43 years old with 2 children, fulfilled his father's wishes. On the headstone, he engraved the phrase that Esther had said so many years ago: "Love is like a candle. You can light 1,000 candles with a single one, and the original flame never goes out." Next to Esther, now also rested Charles, Edward, and Rose, their children. Richard had their remains moved to reunite the family. Not the family of blood, the family of the heart. Matthew visited the graves with his children, a boy named Richard, a girl named Esther. "Dad," asked little Esther, "what was great-grandma like?" Matthew smiled. "She was a woman who understood something very important, that true love isn't seen or touched or bought, but it's felt. And when someone truly loves you, you know it. Even if she's a stranger, you know it. Your great-grandmother came to our estate as a housekeeper. Nobody expected anything from her, but she saw that I was broken, and she decided to stay and pick up the pieces. Night after night, song after song. That's why the foundation bears her name. That's why you bear her name." Little Richard took his dad's hand. "Dad, can you teach us the song?" Matthew felt the tears well up. Of course, champ. And there, in the cemetery, he taught his children the song that had saved him. As they sang, the sun set, painting the sky orange and pink, as if all those who had gone were listening. Caroline, Richard, Esther, Charles, Edward, and Rose, because love doesn't die. It just changes shape. And the song that began at 3 in the morning in a dark estate now filled the world with light. One candle lighting another, and another, and another, to infinity. This was the complete story of Esther Brown, a woman that the cruel world judged by her humble appearance, a woman that a powerful tech mogul wanted to dismiss without knowing her, a woman who changed absolutely everything with a simple song. And if you learned anything important from this story, let it be this: never, ever, underestimate the people that the world ignores and despises. Because sometimes, the true angels don't have shining wings. They have work aprons and hands wrinkled from years of service. And they sing at 3 in the morning when nobody is watching, to save those that nobody else can save. The end.